So most of us on this call are probably already familiar with Ken Wilber's four quadrants, right? Where he's talking about the individual, the collective, and the interior and the exterior, which forms these four quadrants: individual interior, individual exterior, collective interior, collective exterior. Already, this sounds very technical and a little bit maybe hard to relate to, right? A very, very sort of philosophical. So I've boiled this down into four very, very simple words. So the upper left quadrant can be simply described as being. This quadrant focuses on an individual's internal subjective experiences, such as thoughts, emotions, beliefs, and values. It's labeled being because these elements constitute the core of an individual's sense of self and inner world. And then the upper right quadrant, the individual exterior, I call that doing. The doing quadrant represents an individual's observable behaviors, actions, and skills. It includes the tangible, measurable aspects of a person's life, such as their physical health, habits, and performance, etc. And then the lower left quadrant, the interior of the collective, I simply call that being together because it explores the shared intersubjective space between individuals, including our shared experience. And then in the lower right quadrant, the exterior of the collective, I call doing together. Because after all, what else is a system except for things doing something together? It's not just a group of things or a group of holons that are doing their own things. That's not a system. That's sort of chaos. It's when they do things together, when they coordinate their efforts, right? That becomes a system, which is the lower right quadrant, which represents the collective exterior systems and structures that support and organize human interaction, such as laws, institutions, economic systems, and environmental realities. Okay, so we're starting off with these four very, very simple kind of dimensions of ourselves and of our relationships: being, doing, being together, doing together. So now we go from four quadrants to the 8 horizons. How do we do that? It's actually very simple. Let's just look at each one of these from the inside and from the outside. In other words, let's look at being from a first person point of view and a third person point of view. Let's look at doing from a first person point of view and a third person point of view, etc. And when we do that, that takes us from 4 quadrants to the 8 zones. So if we look at, let's start with being. If we look at being from the inside, a first person view of my own being, that looks like awareness, right? Which describes individual inner experiences, feelings, and self perception. This is horizon 1, awareness. If we look at my being from a third person point of view, we see something like the unconscious, which describes the psychological patterns and unconscious motives and shadows and structures and traumas and attachment styles and so forth, right? So here we have horizon 1, awareness, horizon 2, unconscious. Those are the two sort of dimensions of the upper left quadrant of our own being. If we move over to doing, we can see the inside view of doing is something like embodiment. This is describing my physiological drives, neurological factors, health influences, things like sex drive, arousal systems, mirror neurons, a lot of the things that we talk about very, very frequently in this show. If we look at our doing from the outside, it looks like behavior, which is just a third person description of what someone is doing, right? So that includes things like habits, behaviors, practices, actions, strategies, etc. So that's looking at doing from the inside, embodiment, and from the outside, behavior. Now, if we go over into the lower left, being together, we can look at this from the inside and from the outside. From the inside, if we take a first person view of our being together, it looks and feels a lot like connection. It's just the simple mutual experience of resonance, of attunement, of the overall quality of our connection together. It's a felt thing. It's almost like the phenomenology of the relationship in a certain sense. However, we can also look at our intersubjective relationship, our being together, from the outside, which looks something like relationship dynamics. These are the intersubjective dynamics, patterns, and permissions. Now, one of the interesting things here, Keith, is that, and I think we've talked about this before, it can be tricky for a couple, for two people in relationship, to see their own relationship dynamics, right? It can be hard to sort of step outside of the relationship in a certain sense, to be able to look at it kind of objectively and to notice what these patterns are.
Very much
It's
like zone two.
Yeah,
Zone two,
exactly.
very hard to see yourself. Zone four, very hard to see each other as a couple. Oh,
That's
now
right.
what's the key to that, of course, is how are we shift? Because time is happening. How is
Hmm.
all this stuff changing over time? And
Right.
also, is it getting more satisfying and fulfilling over time or less satisfying and fulfilling over time? That
That's
becomes a
right.
critical variable when we're evaluating.
That's right. Well, and the thing with zone 4 that's also true with zone 2 is it's hard to see it in ourselves, but it's a lot easier to see in others, right? So a lot of times, we can look to other think of your parents' relationship dynamics. Something probably comes to mind right away. You can see sort of their style of being together, and maybe that's a style that you emulate if you grew up with, with a healthy family dynamic and all that. Maybe that's something that you emulate in your own relationships, or maybe there were some negative influences in that dynamic. Think about your best friends relationship. You can see other people's relationship dynamics sort of more clearly than we can see our own, which means simply that sometimes if a couple is dealing with problems in these particular horizons, it requires some outside help, right? It might require counseling, for example. It might require Dr. Keith, Dr.
Yeah,
Love to step in and sort of rejigger the relationship dynamics just a little bit so that that love can flow a little bit more easily.
right.
So then we look at the lower right quadrant, our doing together, right? And we can look at that again from the inside or from the outside. From the inside, that looks like what I call the relationship container. So these are the shared practices that we do together to maintain our relationship, right? So this would include things like, let's do weekly check-ins and let's structure this so that we're doing this, weekly. Let's do, make sure that at least once a month we're going out on a date night and we're creating an opportunity for greater intimacy or what have you. So in the lower right quadrant, if we look at that from the first person, this is describing the structures and the systems that we co-create together, that we do together in order to maintain and sustain
And
this
also
relationship,
shared norms.
right?
That a couple needs to feel
Sure.
safe, they have to have the subjective sense of shared norms. People might not be aware of them, but they're there. Okay. And they're important.
Mm-hmm.
How they feel and how
Mm-hmm.
they work or don't work will turn into subjective experiences over in the lower left. But over here, there are definable norms that people develop over time. And sometimes they're not good norms. Sometimes they're
Yeah,
destructive. Like I
that's right.
said, you're either making more love or
That's
you're
right.
not.
Right. Yep, and those norms, and we want to be, we want to be really super precise with our language here. It's always important,
Sure.
right? Because norms, we can think of norms in two ways. We can think of norms as sort of behavioral norms. These are the patterns of doing that we tend to do together, and that would be something we see in the lower right quadrant. Or they can be sort of intersubjective norms, values norms, social expectations and pressures and so forth, which we might locate more in horizon 4 in the
Yeah,
lower
there you
left
go.
quadrant, for example. So there's all different
Yeah.
ways of sort of
Yeah.
approaching this. But if we look at a relationship from the outside view, so not just the inside view in terms of what are the systems that we create to sustain this relationship, but from the outside, we see something like conditions. So these are the social, systemic, and environmental realities within which our relationship, our doing together is situated. So this gives us, again, 8 very, very simple zones for us to track, right? And to keep our eye on in our relationship. We have Horizon 1 awareness, Horizon 2 unconscious, Horizon 3 connection, Horizon 4 dynamics, Horizon 5 embodiment, Horizon 6 behavior, Horizon 7 container, and Horizon 8
And I
conditions.
want to make a point about this. In each one of those, there's more healthy and less healthy has been determined by
That's
both
right.
cultural standards and by a lot of objective research.